Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and here to answer your questions tonight, philosopher and author A.C. Grayling, the Assistant Minister for Science, Jobs and Innovation, Seselja, the former Deputy Leader of the British Labour Party, Harriet Harman, writer, broadcaster and visiting fellow at the Strategic Policy Institute, Catherine McGregor, and a Shadow Minister for Justice, Clare O'Neill. Please welcome our panel. Our Q&A is live in Eastern Australia on ABC TV and live on iView and News Radio at 9:35 Eastern Daylight Saving Time. You can stream us on YouTube, Facebook and Periscope. Our first question tonight comes from Jess Murray.
Good evening, everyone. So earlier today, Michael McCormack became Australia's 18th Deputy Prime Minister. It has also been revealed that in 1993, Mr McCormack wrote an editorial describing the LGBTI community as sordid and unnatural, and also blaming same-sex attracted people for the spread of AIDS. Was the National Party's decision to promote Mr McCormack wise? Catherine.
Bowling right into my area straight away. I wasn't aware of that comment, by the way. I hadn't even seen that report. Obviously, I'd repudiate that remark, and I rather suspect he would also. He
has done, I should tell you. He wrote it. He was an editor of a local newspaper 25 years ago.
Yeah.
He wrote that.
Look, in his defence, I'm not going to defend that sentiment, but it was a much more prevalent sentiment then. And last night we were privileged to see on this network Riot, which showed the quite heroic performance of some of the people from the community to which I broadly belong in defending LGBTI identity and rights, and it was authorised by the state for those people to be bashed and arrested purely for being who they were, and times have moved on, and I think vindicated by the plebiscite result last year, the postal vote. We're in a different country now. I can forgive him for those remarks if he's withdrawn them and stepped away from them. And I wouldn't like to be reminded of everything I said or did 25, 30 years ago. Some of my views have changed. Not on that issue, I might add, but on others. And I generally do get reminded of what I wrote 25 years ago. There's a man called Gerard Henderson, combs through everyone's essays every Friday and from primary school and retails.
He's fun like that, Gerard, isn't he?
Arsenic and old lace.
Claire.
Well, I think the comments are terrible, and what Catherine said absolutely stands. He shouldn't have said those things. I think the broader point here is that we're ending up with a Deputy Prime Minister that probably you and most of the people in the audience have never heard of before, and that is a little bit concerning. You know, for one of the things for Barnaby Joyce to have kind of left in the wake of all the things that have happened, that's one of the consequences. I am hopeful, though not very optimistic, that this is going to allow us to move on a little bit in Australian politics. I'm sure I speak for many of us when I say I'm sick of talking about Barnaby Joyce's personal life. Don't want to hear anything more about it.
Are you saying it's time to have a boring Deputy Prime Minister?
Well, what I'm saying, Tony, is that every time Barnaby Joyce is on the front page of the newspaper, that is a missed opportunity for us to talk about the things that really matter to you and the people that I represent. You know, we've got some really big problems in this country, a climate that's getting warmer, no policy to fix it. We've got Australian households who are seeing their living standards over time get worse, not better. What a huge problem for our country. And instead of talking about this, we're mired in this controversy that has occupied pretty much the country for the last 3 weeks in politics. And I hope we can move on from that now.
Zed, Michael McCormack, what do you think of him?
Yeah, look...
And actually you could reflect on the question, in fact.
Sure. Well, look, I mean, I think it's probably been dealt with in terms of his repudiation of those views from many years ago. But just on Michael, I wouldn't say I know him intimately, but I have gotten to know him a bit over the years. He lives just down the road in Wagga from where I am in Canberra. Happens to be the place where my wife comes from, so a beautiful place. He's a very strong local representative, has a great reputation there, and he's been a great advocate for small business, for obviously the farming sector, the agricultural sector. He is someone who works very, very hard, has a strong reputation for doing that. So to directly answer your question, yes, I think they have made a wise decision. Of course, it'll be up to Michael. It's a big deal to be promoted to the Deputy Prime Ministership and in difficult circumstances, of course. No one would have anticipated this a few weeks ago, that we would be where we are. But Michael, I think, is someone who is a fierce advocate for rural and regional Australia, but also for small business, for a stronger economy, for all of the things that we as a coalition government stand for. So, I'm very excited about the prospects of working with Michael. I know the Prime Minister is, and I think he'll be a great servant of our nation.
And are you relieved?
Well, look,
to have this over?
Look, Tony, it's been a very difficult few weeks, but, we can look at the politics of it, and it's obviously been a difficult few weeks, but it's been a difficult few weeks in particular for some individuals who have been seeing their lives discussed and dissected in the media. And so that's been a very difficult process, obviously most prominently for Barnaby Joyce's ex-wife, Natalie, for his daughters, and obviously for his new partner, Vicky, and of course there is an unborn son there as well. So there's a lot of people, and of course Barnaby, has acknowledged his mistakes, but he's had a pretty heavy microscope on those mistakes in the public realm over the last few weeks. So look, I think that you wouldn't want to be in a position where you're talking about these kind of things all the time, but I would say far more important than the politics is some of those individuals who have really, been dragged through it.
Harriet, I'll bring you to the question, and I guess, do you think it's fair enough to be forgiven 25 years later for quite strident and some would say offensive views that you held back in the 1990s?
Well, I think that for all society has really moved on, there is still a lot of homophobia and discrimination against gay people, and I think for coming out for many people is still a very traumatic thing, and therefore I think I can only imagine the kind of chill that people must have, the shiver down their spine that many people must have felt when they heard these remarks, and that they came from somebody who is now the Deputy Prime Minister. So I think he will have a lot, they were a while ago, but he will have a lot to prove that actually he has left that discrimination behind. So, perhaps we'll have to see him on a gay pride march leading it, really showing that he has changed, but with a Labour Party, and we believe in redemption, so perhaps he can, improve. But I think one thing that was surprising to me being over here when all this is happening is when I became deputy leader of my party, I had to go all around the country. I had to meet thousands of people and try to persuade them to vote for me and to build their confidence. And so it seemed to me quite surprising that, a deputy resigns, on the Friday, and then on the Monday, another one is elected. And we've certainly found in our party in the UK that when we had a coronation, a sort of internal decision, rather than an outward-facing election, sometimes it doesn't test people. So you don't really know whether they can do the job. So he'll have to prove he can do the job, as well as proving that he's left behind those repulsive homophobic views.
Anthony Grayling. Yes, go.
Well, first I'm tremendously admire and applaud the generosity with which Catherine has forgiven him. When you consider how really awful it was to be on the receiving end of those sorts of views and attitudes. And by the way, talk about the 1990s. We were campaigning about this in the 70s and 60s, and it took a heck of a long time, but it does show that campaigning works. If you argue, if you're courageous, if you stand up, eventually we get to a situation where it would just be out of the question for anybody in public life, or indeed anywhere really, to say those sorts of things now. And that is something. Harriet is right, of course, these attitudes still prevail, and unfortunately we seem to be swinging back a little bit. There are people around who are saying these things again. We only have to look across the Atlantic, and or what's the ocean between here and there? It's the Pacific. Yeah, I remember that. And you see that kind of thing is being said still. But nevertheless, there are people who are not prepared to put up with it, and it's easier to fight against it now because of the great success of people like Catherine and others who've been so brave, stood up for those rights and achieved them.
Well, let's move on somewhat gratefully from Australian politics. The next question's from Cooper Gannon.
After the recent Russian interference in the US election, we've been told that they were able to use social media to further their agenda. Considering that 79% of us use social media, what can be done to block false information being spread to a large number of Australian voters in a similar scenario?
Catherine McGregor.
Thanks for that question, and it raises a very broad issue about the fact that we're now living in the information age. And I always go back to first principles by dint of the training and experience I had. I was trained primarily as a military officer and as an academic discipline as a military historian. And I think the best thinker on the nature and character of war was von Clausewitz, the Prussian who died in 1830, but wrote some enduring truths that have held up very well with the passage of time. And he talked of war as being the true chameleon that takes on the hue of the era in which it's being conducted. The Russians definitely intervened in the 2016 presidential election. Only absolute cranks deny that now. As to whether the President of the United States was complicit in that, I give him the benefit of the doubt until there's an absolute smoking gun. But it is quite clear that the Clinton campaign was targeted specifically at the direction of the Kremlin. There are a number of issues around this. Putin was obsessed with Clinton. He's paranoid about the United States per se. And just some quick history, I don't want to take up too much time, but he was the first foreign leader to ring George Bush on 9/11. He believed there would be a modus vivendi emerge between the United States and Russia against Islamic extremism. Then the invasion of Iraq occurred, and the rhetoric from the neocons particularly started to terrify him. Observers of the Kremlin say that two things have really wounded this guy's psyche. One was he was a station chief in Dresden for the KGB when the Berlin Wall came down. He rang head office from Dresden with a riot outside, and no one answered the phone. And everything this man had believed in as a loyal operative of the KGB was shattered, and he regarded it, and he said it on the public record in Munich in 2007, that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest cataclysm of the 20th century.
So, Catherine, do you think the weaponisation of social media information directed by Putin, a former intelligence officer?
Absolutely.
How serious is that as a threat? Does it extend beyond the United States?
Absolutely.
The question I wanted to know if it could happen here.
Yeah, well, there already is. The Australian Signals Directorate published in its public reporting that there were at least 1,200 cyber incidents, or so-called, in 2015. I've seen higher figures since. It's an escalating problem. When you go to a coffee shop tomorrow morning, look around and see everyone scrolling their phones. They're all using social media. They'll go to work and get into an elevator that's powered by a grid that's digitised. They'll ride public transport that is reliant on the unimpeded access to the global commons that's provided through cyber linkages to space satellites, and so on. With all that connectivity comes tremendous vulnerability. And the Russians have part of their strategic culture going right back to the Soviet era, have hardwired into their military and intelligence apparatus the concept of information war. We're still catching up, to be quite honest. We've got substantial capabilities in this area, both in terms of passive and active defence measures that are operative every day. And we can, if necessary, reach out and take more overt action, but we basically operate within the laws of armed conflict. They draw no distinction between situations of peace and war. They have a doctrine that says that they are constantly in struggle with the West.
So this is war by another means, is what you're saying?
Absolutely. The pen is mightier than the sword is the cliche. And they call it information operations. They saw the fault lines in US society and the fracture points. They didn't create them. They're a function that I'm sure the professor will talk about much more in his dissertation later on. But the fault lines in our political system, and I think the Electoral College lent itself particularly to destabilisation because it allows very narrow casting of messages that can be amplified. And they mobilise people through bot farms, through a thing called the Internet Research Agency, which is run by an oligarch close to Putin himself. So Putin's an interesting character. He was obsessed with the death of Gaddafi. He watches that on replays.
Catherine, I'm going to have to pass it around the table, so hold up some of those thoughts. And Anthony Grayling, so I will bring you in for your dissertation now. Make it brief, though, if you can.
Sorry.
Yeah, I will. I mean, I agree with all that. There's no question but that in the international domain, what the Nobel Prize was given for last autumn for nudging, that and worse, for actually hacking, intervening, putting out false information, getting involved in things like the presidential election, like the Brexit referendum, all that seems to be out there in the public domain now. And of course, it's become acutely important that there should be some control over that activity and some transparency about who's doing it and why they're doing it. I'll give you an example. You are all profiled, we're all of us profiled all the time in our use of what social media routes we're on. So if you use the internet or if you're on WhatsApp or Facebook or something, that provides information, resources to people who control these media so that they can target advertising at you. That's the obvious thing. But it's also the case, and it's a very worrying fact, that when you go looking for information on the internet, you will be given information which the algorithms out there think you would like to know on the basis of your profile. And that's very distorting. And even worse than that, well, a chum of mine came over to London a few weeks ago from New York. He said he had put into his Google diary the fact that he had an outpatient's appointment at some local hospital. And for the next 3 days, he was bombarded by advertisements from his local crematorium. Well, this just shows you how closely everybody's being tracked. And the thing is that if you're messaged, and these techniques that are now available, the hyper-targeting techniques based on these profiles, being able to identify groups and group concerns, honing messaging to those groups, getting them to think and believe certain things, very often false, distorted or semi-true things, and being able therefore to aggregate groups of people. So it was argued in the case of the Trump election, you've got people who are going to support Trump and people who are going to support Clinton. They've made up their minds and they tune out of the process. But the people in the middle, the people who haven't made up their minds or who can have their minds changed, who can be manipulated, they get relentlessly targeted. Not just vote for so-and-so, but also don't vote for the other person. Or, as happened in the case of the EU referendum, Remainers were told, you're going to win easily. Of course, nobody's stupid enough to want to leave the EU. So, you know, if it rains in your constituency on the day, you don't have to go out. You mean? Yeah. Oh, yeah, I mean, plenty. You know, Fred from Neasden turned out to be Vladimir from Vladivostok in so many cases. Because, of course, talk about our friend Mr. Putin, it's in his interests to weaken the EU and to distract them. You talk about, your chum Barnaby, on the front pages of the newspapers here for 3 weeks. Well, we've had it for nearly 2 years now, complete distraction over Brexit, and our government doing nothing else because they're paralysed by it. And this is the result, in part, of interference and manipulation and misinformation, which has resulted
Anthony, I'm just going to interrupt you because our questioner Cooper has his hand up. Go ahead.
Just quickly, would you happen to believe there's anything in the near future that a third party would be interested in influencing, particularly in the Australian theatre?
Harriet, I'll bring you in here. And did you get warnings of this when you were in government, the sort of things that were happening?
No, because we got kicked out of government in 2010, and it's amazing how quickly things have changed. Yeah. But I think that, there is obviously great vulnerability, as we've heard, and, our democracy is the most precious thing. We have to be completely alert and concerned about anything that would undermine that. But it's a strange thing in a way about the connection between internet and politics, because in some ways it presents a real threat, but in other ways it's been a huge opportunity. For example, elections in the UK have often been swayed by unaccountable, extremely well-off media moguls printing things that we would regard to be far from the truth. And actually the internet has meant that people get their news from each other and in different ways, and those media moguls who control a few newspapers are not so powerful. In America, organizations like the National Rifles Associations that's given money for people to campaign for their election campaigns, actually you don't need to have money so much in election campaigns anymore because the internet is free and you can communicate for free. And when I first started out in politics, I mean, the House of Commons was a completely closed sort of activity. There was no TV and no radio broadcasting what we were doing. Now it's much more transparent. Everybody can see what we're doing. So I think that actually there's a massive positive effect for people to self-organise and engage in politics in a way that they weren't able to before. There is a massive
Harriet,
threat.
No one noticed in the United States what the Russians were doing at the time. Well, the FBI
they
may
did
have.
actually.
Yeah.
The FBI did, but
And so did
there is a
GCHQ.
threat, but you know, and these people who are running all these companies, they're clever enough to work out the internet. They should be clever enough to help governments to sort out the problems.
Well, let's just see. I'm just going to go to
Zed.
can government sort out a problem like this? I mean, you're the Minister for Innovation. Is it time to start innovating?
Well, look, yes. There's a lot of great innovations. Coincidentally, I was with a great local business in Canberra today, talking to them about cyber security and some of the countermeasures that innovative businesses are doing. And we've put a lot of money on the table. I think it was $230 million. Then there was $400 million as part of the defence white paper. There's been other commitments.
We're putting money on the table to stop the Russians interfering in our elections.
To put on in cyber security, obviously, generally, and there's a range of things. Can I say, in terms of picking up Harriet's point to some degree, one, the challenges have changed. So there's a positive and a negative we can identify. Previously, we used to worry about not enough views being there. Now there are so many different views, but of course they can be manipulated like they always could have been. We used to worry more about government having our information, and people still, to some degree, rightly, will be concerned about those things. The Australia card was a great debate, whereas with our phones, we give up a hell of a lot more information to Facebook and Google and others. And I would just come back to Harriet on that point. We used to have big media moguls. We still sort of do with Facebook and Google and some of those. I mean, they are immensely powerful in terms of those sort of things. So, one, they can help fight where there is genuine, state-sponsored cyber warfare. But also, we wouldn't want to see them necessarily censoring views that they may or may not agree with. So,
okay, I'm just going to interrupt you there because I'm going to move on. Remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, let us know on Twitter. Keep an eye on the RMIT ABC Fact Check and the Conversation website for the results. The next question comes from Shannon Said.
Good evening, everyone. Political commentator Douglas Murray has said in his recent book that Europe is committing suicide. And former British PM David Cameron has said that multiculturalism has failed in the UK. In an environment where Western Judeo-Christian values are open to continuous scrutiny, but it seems that non-Western cultural values escape such scrutiny, are immune to it, what becomes of European and, by extension, Western society and identity?
Harriet, I'm going to go back to you on this because obviously that's connected up to David Cameron's comments on multiculturalism and so on.
Well, I don't think it's right that multiculturalism has failed. And I think, in a way, the best perspective for this is the human rights perspective, the human right of each individual. So, yeah, your question is so many-layered, I almost kind of don't know which point to go in on it at.
I might just go back to Shannon. When you talk about this book by Douglas Murray, he's a journalist and author, why is he saying that Europe is committing suicide?
The title of the book is basically talking about identity, immigration and Islam. So he's critiquing that quite heavily in terms of the sheer number of immigrants that, since the German decision to open the borders has had. The UK particularly, from the gist of what I've heard from him, in terms of Sharia law, the enclaves it's creating, and David Cameron talks about this as well, where is integration working, or are we encouraging not multiculturalism, but just these groups?
So this is the notion that traditional Europe is losing its identity to Islam. Is that what you're saying?
Islam, amongst other factors, yes.
All right. Catherine?
Well, I'm a bit sceptical of the claim, but there is a basis to reality in that, certainly, in that there are arrondissements in Paris, evidently, that are no-go areas for the French police now on account of enclaves of people who simply refuse to acknowledge the legitimacy of the French state. Now, you can't have that and have effective multiculturalism. I don't believe it's an issue here, and I believe European civil society is incredibly resilient. I spend a deal of time there. And I'm very torn on this claim as well, in that Western Judeo-Christian ethic, the loudest defenders of that are people who don't think that I should be allowed to serve in the military forces of this country, to which the Defence for Transgendered Military Service. But on your broad point, I don't think we should censor this discussion. I agree with Harriet. I think multiculturalism, on balance, enriches societies. I do think there are enclaves in parts of Europe that clearly are becoming problematic, and there is a nexus between failure to assimilate and difficulties with law enforcement and long-term unemployment and welfare. There's no evading that. There's no naysaying that. And I come to this debate as someone who plays as a trans woman in a winter cricket competition in an all-male Pakistani team, diaspora Pakistani.
I promise we'll come back to that later. But actually, I want to hear from Anthony on the question about Europe. Is Europe committing suicide because of Muslim immigration, if we want to boil that question down?
No, I don't think so. I think the problem about immigration is a problem felt by people in the host or home community into which the immigrants come. If they're welcoming, if they understand the point of immigration, if they see what immigrants bring and contribute, then their attitude is such that there won't be tensions or conflicts. But if they're hostile, if they're ignorant about the benefits that accrue, I mean, in the case of the UK, for example, for every £1 spent in a clinic or a school on the children or the family of positive
We have had largely a very, very successful migration program, a very successful multicultural society. Now, I don't think we've seen that develop into the idea of enclaves, the idea of view that the best way to deal with your demographic challenges necessarily was to make the kind of decisions that were made by the German government. I think that the German people, actually, most of them would support multiculturalism in one form or another, but when they feel that things are not controlled and when they feel that the numbers are coming very quickly without the government really being in charge, then I think that does undermine confidence. And I think senior members of the German government would acknowledge that, and in some ways with some of their policy changes have acknowledged that. So we should look at our success story. We shouldn't take that for granted.
Well, Tony Abbott didn't take it for granted. He's saying we should now very fast wind back immigration, you know, I think by 70,000 a year is what he's suggesting. What is he playing at, do you think?
Well, look, I'm not going to read into his motivations. I can respond to his proposal. I don't agree with reducing immigration in that way. I think that certainly there are concerns in our community about, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, the pressures of population growth. There's no doubt about that.
The immigration debate?
No, and I wrote about it last Friday. I think his motives are transparent. I like Greg Sheridan, who's been a friend even longer. I've known Tony for about 35 years. I think Sheridan goes back further with him than that. And I would say two things in his defence. One is he's a person of great magnanimity. He doesn't hold grudges, but I do think he has lost balance over Malcolm Turnbull. I think he's consumed by that, and sometimes he is not the best self that he's capable of. He's a person I know of enormous generosity. I've been a beneficiary of it. I drew a line on a totally unrelated issue and felt that I had to say something public, and I was hurt by something he did, and we reconciled, especially after his father had died. I reached out to him. It would have been utterly inappropriate not to extend my sympathy at the time his dad died. All I've said to him, I'm not breaking a confidence when I say this, because I've had this discussion with other people close to him and people in the media and the political process, that I believe he erred in not really basically letting last year run its course. I was a sympathiser of his, but I said two things to him, almost a year to the day, in fact. I remember I was in hospital at the time and I sent him a text and I just said, nominated a couple of outlets that I thought he should stay away from in the media, and don't go down the Trump road if you want to retain the Menzies centre-right tradition in Australian politics. And I had the same conversation with Chris Mitchell, the former editor-in-chief of The Australian, and also Paul Kelly. And I just said to him, you should shut up. The guy who you should emulate is Keating. Keating tried to take Hawke down, and when it failed, he made the party come to him. And I said, this bloke's got a cloth ear. And that's been revealed too. I gave him the benefit of the doubt after he looked like he'd rallied over Christmas. And we've had 2 weeks of unrelenting disaster, which I'll close out on. Paul Keating had a great saying, mate, never nurse a mug, they'll die in your arms. And I gave him a break and thought he was going to win.
Okay, let's move on from right-wing populism to left-wing populism, and a question from Chris Mears.
Thank you very much for taking my question, first off. So my question is, Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders often talk of democratic socialism, a form of left-wing populism. So why do we here in the West not look upon left-wing populism with the same aura of fear with which we observe right-wing populism? Have we so easily forgotten the events of the 20th century? And most importantly, why do we ignore the unfolding crisis and example of Venezuela, where even under a democratically socialist elected government, the situation continues to worsen?
Harriet, you can reflect on the leader of the Labor Party, I'm sure. Jeremy Corbyn, is he a sort of dangerous left-wing radical?
Well, he's not a demagogue stirring up division. He's actually trying to stir up unity and try and evoke progressive values. And I hope that it will prove populist. I hope it will prove popular. I mean, it is the easiest thing, as we've just been talking about, to stoke up division by fear and stoke up hatred. So, obviously I'm hoping that the programme that's being put forward by Jeremy Corbyn, which is actually a very reasonable and sensible programme as well as a progressive one, will work out. But we have had a very interesting and unusual phenomenon that we haven't seen in UK politics before in quite this way, which is the leader of the Labour Party goes to any city or town in the country, and there are literally tens of thousands of people chanting his name like as if he's a rock star, and that is a very unusual phenomenon.
How do you explain this? Because it's true of Bernie Sanders as well, that there's a tremendous young following for both of them, and those young people came out and gave him a tremendous boost in the last election.
But there isn't an edge to it. It's not against anybody. It's not stirring up so that everybody rushes out of these stadia in order to make people's lives miserable and attack them in the streets. It is he talks about kindler, gentler politics. So it is a very unusual, strange happening, but hopefully will lead to more kindler, gentler politics and more progressive values. There's no parallel at all between that sort of activity and what the right does, which is stir up hatred and fear.
Zed, what do you think?
Well, look, on Jeremy Corbyn, I'm not going to claim to be an expert, but, I certainly, some of my observations when we've seen some of the strong claims even coming from within the Labor Party in the UK around some of the anti-Semitism within parts of that government. I think there is some anti and some stirring up in parts, so I don't accept that it's all sweetness and light coming from the socialists on the left. But to your broader point, I think it's a very legitimate point to say There are extremes in politics, there's no doubt about it, at both ends of the spectrum. But I think that the left often gets a bit of a free pass. And I'll say something probably in this audience that will no doubt not get me cheers. But when we look at, how we treat One Nation versus the Greens in political discourse, in many cases the Greens are treated as a serious political party when they consistently attract about 8% of the vote, and One Nation, who attracts around the same percent of the vote in many elections, is treated as sort of the Antichrist. Now, I don't have a lot of time for most of One Nation's policies, but I tell you what, the Greens' policies are pretty extreme. And so we have this debate always about preferences from the right, from One Nation, but never the same scrutiny on Labor with preferences from the Greens. So I think it's a really legitimate point you raise, and I think it's been part of our discourse, and it's probably something we need to call out more.
You would have been very much aware of Matthias Cormann, your senior cabinet colleague, trying to make the link between Corbyn and Bill Shorten, suggesting that Shorten was plagiarising Corbyn and trying to emulate him. Well, look, I think there's plenty of evidence of that, and Bill Shorten.
What evidence is there of that?
Well, in terms of a number of the policies that.
Like what?
Well, let's look at is there any tax increase? $160 billion in new taxes at the last election, yet you're still going to run larger deficits. I would say that's a fairly socialistic, or certainly moving much further to the left agenda. So you've asked for one example. There's $160 billion. Well, that was the tax increases when you look at the increases.
I think you're making these up, but
I think these are Treasury figures, and yet the deficits would have been larger. So he is dragging his party is going to the left. Whether Bill Shorten is dragging them to the left, whether he's responding to the left wing of his party, is an open question. Let's look at. Let me throw that open question to Clare O'Neill, because here's a right-wing Labor politician famous for being on the right faction, being referred to as a left-wing Jeremy Corbyn-style leader. How did that happen?
Well, if I can give a small bit of political advice to the Liberals, it would be just, can you work out, please, what the problem with Bill Shorten is? That he's too right-wing or too left-wing, because I can't quite work it out. Going back to the Jeremy Corbyn issue, I'm not aware of a single policy that Labor shares with Jeremy Corbyn, and I'm not saying that defensively. I'm literally not aware of one. But I would say that there is a similarity in the sense of what we're trying to tackle between the Labor Party in the UK and the Labor Party in Australia, and that is, in both countries, there's a big problem with the economy, and that is inequality is getting to levels which are intolerable to the people that we represent. 9 Australians today, the 9 richest people in this country, control as much wealth as the poorest 4.5 million people. Now, that's just wrong. We also know that, an Indigenous man is twice as likely to have a prison record than a university degree. And we see these differences and disparities when, children are as young as 3 or 4. Now, that's just not expressing the values of egalitarianism and equality that I know Australians share. And we've got a policy platform that will help us tackle some of those things in, I would say, a more pragmatic and nuanced way perhaps than what we see in the UK. But the fundamental problem is the same.
Anthony, do you think there's a left-wing populist movement to rival Donald Trump and the people who ran the Brexit campaign?
Well, I think it's a mistake to look for parallels which are quite as simple as that. On the particular Jeremy Corbyn issue, there are many policies that Corbyn and his group in the Labour Party have put forward which are very attractive, and one would hope that if ever they were in a position to implement them, they would be able to afford them. But you're going to get the impression pretty soon, rightly, that I'm obsessed about the Brexit issue, because what I cannot stand and cannot accept from Jeremy Corbyn and his rather few allies in the Labour Party, because I'm sure Harriet's going to agree with me that the majority of the parliamentary Labour Party, and I think the majority of people in the country, do not support the Labour leadership on Brexit. They just don't. And Labour has got to watch out.
In the sense that Labour doesn't have the courage to say we'll go back to the electorate on this and try and get it reversed.
Which they should. And by the way, that would be by far the simplest, most direct way to get over what is now an extremely divided, toxically angry population in the UK, but this very unnecessary referendum. This was the Conservative Party at war with itself, and it has been for years, and it's all spilled over and caused absolute havoc in the UK. And it's distressing to see Corbyn and John McDonnell and Seamus Milne and those people who, a little clique in the Labour Party, who I think Harriet can perhaps confirm or disconfirm this, but their reason for wanting a Brexit to happen is they have a programme of wanting to renationalise energy and transport and so on, and that makes good sense, that policy, but they would like to do it on the cheap. In other words, if you're in the EU requires of you to pay for those assets at the market rate. And I think the people who are formulating this policy in the Labour Party certainly don't want to do that. But there is a big warning sign for the Labour Party, which is that its relative success in the last election last year was the result of a massive amount of tactical voting to show dissatisfaction with what's happening in the Brexit process.
Let me just quickly go to Harriet. Do you think it would be a smart move for Labor to actually make a solid decision on this and decide to go with the policy of trying to reverse Brexit, which is essentially what Anthony is saying?
Well, I think the problem is that both Anthony and I disagree with the way people ultimately voted, only by a narrow majority. I think when people say Britain has decided to leave the EU, they haven't. It was, unfortunately, 52% to 48% in a referendum, which I wish David Cameron had never called, and no doubt David Cameron wishes he'd never called, since he didn't expect to lose it. But once you have had a referendum, and once that decision has been made to leave, it is very difficult to turn round to people and say, my goodness me, you have made this terrible mistake. You have to kind of find your way forward from a situation where we are both in opposition, so we're not the government, we can't set the agenda and lead the negotiations, but also we're dealing with a referendum result which we think is deeply, deeply unfortunate, and paradoxically will actually hit hardest at those areas.
But very briefly, why couldn't Labor
leave.
simply come up with a direct policy of saying we'll attempt to reverse Brexit?
Well, because I think
if that were as popular as you're suggesting, wouldn't that be a good electoral move?
Well, I think the problem is that people having voted leave, even by a small majority, are kind of waiting for the idea that we in Parliament, because we didn't want that result, are going to double-cross them.
No,
and I think we've just got to find our way forward from there. And I think that to give him the benefit of the doubt on this is, Jeremy Corbyn does not want the economy to go off the edge of a cliff, which is where it appears to be headed under the Conservatives.
Okay, I'm just going to give Anthony a quick right of reply.
I have to jump in with the very, very greatest respect. The point is, if you look at the figures in the referendum, 37% of the electorate voted to leave. Now, by no stretch of the imagination is that anywhere near a vote sufficient for a major constitutional change with all these consequences. Now, you politicians, you always talk about the number of votes cast on the day, and you don't look at the bigger picture. You say 51.9% of people voted to leave. Well, in fact, if you're a psephologist, you can predict with great accuracy the drop in the turnout in a constituency if it rains on the day of the vote. In London, it bucketed down, as it sometimes does in London. It bucketed down on the day of the vote, and the drop in the turnout in London alone was larger than the margin by which the
If only you had compulsory voting.
Trust me.
So I think the Labour Party...
I'm sorry, but the idea, Anthony, that we, as politicians, don't see the bigger picture, is just nonsense. Of course we see the bigger picture, but we are in a situation where we have to find our way forward from a referendum decision, one which I wish we'd never had, and the result is, in my view, wrong. But you can't just turn around and say, you lot, you've all got it wrong. It's partly that attitude that lent so many people the sense, well, we're going to give those people a kicking. They're fed up with being told what to think, and they took it into their own hands to disagree with the people who they thought were telling them all the time what's best for them, and actually, I think, have made a very counterproductive decision. But the idea that there's any easy route out, which if only us politicians who support the EU were a bit more courageous or not so small-minded, would be an easy path. I think that's easy for a commentator, but actually we've got to find our way forward, and it's difficult.
You have to disagree.
Okay, yes, you will have to agree to disagree. You're watching Q&A live. Remember, if you can't get into the studio, you can submit a question via video or Skype. Go to our website to find out how to do that. Our next question comes from Ivy Sweeney.
Is the lack of female representation in politics causing a failure of democracy?
Yeah, Clare, start with you.
Well, I think failure of democracy is stronger than I would put it, but I think it is a very significant issue that I would like your help to try to resolve. It's surprising, I think, for many Australians to learn that only a third of our members of parliament in this country are female, and that puts us about 50th in the world of our female representation in parliament. We're behind some quite obscure and unexpected countries like South Africa, Cuba, Mexico, Rwanda, and the UK has us doing quite a lot better than us, Harriet. So I think this is an urgent problem that really needs to be resolved. It's quite different when you look at the two political parties, and I say this not to be political, but just to explain what is going on. The party that I'm in, the Labor Party, has had affirmative action policies for 20 years now, and as a consequence, we have almost 50% representation women in my party. Zed's party don't have any specific policies that try to bring women into Parliament, and as a consequence, only 20% of Liberal Party MPs are female. Now, that is just not a healthy dynamic to have in a party room. It's not a healthy dynamic to have around a cabinet table. And we need to fix this problem on the Conservative side of politics. It's probably electorally beneficial for Labor to look so much more like modern Australia than the Liberal Party does, but it worries me a lot because I care passionately about our country and I know that the best decisions for women are not being made. And we see that quite frequently. Just a quick example, in the last budget that the Turnbull government put together, when you combined a series of decisions that affected primarily women, there were women in this country who faced a 100% tax rate going back to work after they'd had a child. Now, those decisions don't get made when you've got enough women who are sitting around a cabinet table, who are sitting in a caucus room making decisions. So it's an urgent problem, perhaps not a breakdown in democracy, but it has real policy consequences. And I hope you're a member of a political party and getting excited about trying to come in and help solve the problem.
Catherine.
I'm going to take a rain check on this. I'm a trans woman and I make no secret of that, and I actually made those remarks in this studio last week when I was on an all-trans panel, and I think I have a fairly restrained right to comment on issues affecting born women, frankly. I always make that point quite clear. On this day 6 years ago, I was living as a male. It was the 26th of February 2012. I was at an ODI at the Sydney Cricket Ground watching India play Australia. I don't buy into these arguments unless I'm really strongly invited. I think, per se, a broader demographic in most organisations tends to tap a greater talent pool. Demographically, it is insane not to have a larger number of women when women are a majority of the population, as I understand it, a narrow majority of the population. So innately unrepresentative bodies don't tend to be as productive and cohesive as more representative. But I honestly can't add to this with any integrity, I don't feel. I'll leave it to Harriet.
Okay, Harriet.
Well, I think that politics is supposed to be representative. And when I was first elected some 30 years ago, there was 97% men and only 3% women in the House of Commons. So Parliament, women's voices were simply not heard. But that was really at a time when the idea was that men made decisions and women abided by them. And the biggest aspiration a girl growing up in my time was to get a husband. And once you'd achieved that fantastic ambition to actually be a great housewife. And actually, one of the biggest transformative movements of the modern age has been the women's movement saying, no, we're not here to catch a husband and then support him. We're here to work together for other women and to be on equal terms, and not just to have men making the decisions and women abiding by them. And therefore, that going from 3%, and it was the same in Australia, hardly any women in public life, to actually women having their say in public life has been amazing progress, but it still has yet further to go. But it's really beneficial because what it's about is about democracy representing everybody and everybody's voices being heard. And incidentally, when I was first in the House of Commons, there was not one single black member of Parliament. And that meant that the people in the House of Commons, they couldn't speak with any understanding or authority of the lives of black and Asian people or any understanding of women's lives, and the decision-making was flawed as a result. So actually, just as you need members of parliament from every different state and territory, you actually need different sorts of people, diverse people, and certainly it's just downright discriminatory to exclude women. But we've still outnumbered. We've come a long way, but we're still outnumbered in any walk of life. Women are breaking through, but we've still got a long way to go. But I've got huge optimism for the next generation.
I'm going to go to another question, a slightly contrary one on a similar subject.
Sorry, Tony, can I briefly come in on this? I haven't had an opportunity, given Clare's comments. I actually agree with much of what Clare said. I think that there should be more Liberal women in Parliament. There's no doubt about it. I think the numbers are lower than I would like.
Can I just ask you, Zed, I was watching on television, you know, the deputy thing, and I saw this woman, Bridget
McKenzie,
and I thought she spoke with sort of grace and measured, and she was, you know, dealing with all the problems that are obviously in the National Party, and I thought, why is her name not in the frame? And we've got this other guy, Michael McCormack.
She's wonderful, Bridget McKenzie. Can I say the main thing that counted against her is she's a senator. So I think they did want to choose from the House of Representatives for their deputy leader. I think it's fair to say I think Bridget would have done an outstanding job. There's no doubt about it. Can I just say...
It was an interesting image, though. I mean, it was Bridget, I think one other woman, and everyone else was a bloke.
Indeed, and there should be more. But I don't agree with the quotas. I think we need to find a Liberal way of doing it. I think we do it with mentoring. I think we do it with changing the internal culture. There's all sorts of ways. And Tony, I can report there is hope, and it's out of Canberra. In the ACT, as of a few weeks ago, there is a majority of women in the Labor Party represented in the Assembly. There is a majority of women in the Liberal Party represented in the Assembly. Liberals have gotten there without quotas. I think you can do it. It's a small example, but it's done through cultural change and all sorts of things. So you can do it. I think we will find a Liberal way of doing it. But I agree that it's something we do need to work on because we want to see more diverse representation in our party.
And you know, I say respectfully to you, Zed, because I'm glad that you share the overall aspiration. But the reality is today that your political party is going backwards. Things are actually getting worse. So there may be a Liberal way of doing it, but I've never heard of what it is. And the fact is, we know quotas work. They've worked in the Labor Party. And I think there needs to be a conversation within the Liberal Party about taking real action on this, because without that, you're moving in the wrong direction.
OK, I'm going to take our next question. It's from Graham Robertson. It's a slightly contrary view of the women's issues we are talking broadly about. Go ahead.
Thanks, Tony. My question's for Ms Harman. Clinical psychologist Dr Jordan Peterson has stated that reducing any pay gap analysis to a single variable such as gender is not only scientifically flawed, but grossly irresponsible. He argues that gender is not the determining factor in pay differences, and that there are other far more influential variables, such as a person's agreeableness, and that have a far greater influence on a person's income. How do you respond to his findings that your pay is determined by your actions and not your identity?
Harriet, we'll start with you because it's become a huge issue in the United Kingdom.
Well, I'm glad I haven't come across this person, quite frankly, actually.
You're quite a famous Canadian.
Right. Well, you know, if we've got a big pay gap. I mean, women are working now as well as men, and, you know, household budgets are depending on women's income as well as men. And actually, there is not a single public service or a single commercial sector which would operate without women's work. And therefore, we've got a situation where women are paid per hour, some probably 30% less than men. And we can't just put it down to the fact that they're not so committed to their work, they're not so intelligent.
Or less agreeable.
Or less agreeable. I mean, it's a past reflection of a time when the man's domain was to be out being the breadwinner and the woman's domain was at the home, and therefore she had no role in the workplace. And really, we need pay scales and pay rates and employment practices to catch up with what has actually happened. And women these days do not accept the idea, whatever this John guy says, they do not accept the idea that they are less valuable at work than their male counterparts. So whatever the explanation is, I don't think women are interested in that anymore. I think they're going out to work, they're working hard, they're equally educated as men, they're equally committed to their work. So they're not interested in the justifications or excuses of the pay gap. They actually want action. And I'm glad to see that there's a big movement in Australia as well to get
Let's quickly go back to our question to Graham. Do you want to respond to that? I mean, do you think this whole issue is being exaggerated in some way?
It's not something that I see. I work in technology, so innovation is everything to us. So looking for the right people, the right talent. I don't see a gender pay gap. We will search globally to find the right people, and it's really tough. So it doesn't matter the person's gender. So I'm just struggling to understand when somebody, obviously a clinical psychologist, is running his studies, doing his analysis, and finding that people of any gender who are more assertive actually do better when it comes to their remuneration, their income, and it's not tied to a person's gender. It's tied to other variables.
Okay. Fair enough. Let's go to Clare.
Well, I'm very concerned about this person's work because it seems to imply that women must be fundamentally much less agreeable than men. I mean, that is the ultimate conclusion, isn't it, if there's a pay gap?
He's saying that women are typically more agreeable. I'm not saying that's just what he's finding.
But if we were more agreeable, wouldn't we be getting paid more, not less?
No, you're not arguing his position, not mine.
Oh, right.
His position is that you're not being forceful enough, not arguing when a male typically will go in and fight and to negotiate.
Okay, well, I mean, I just start this conversation from a completely different starting point, and that is that I fundamentally believe that intelligence and ambition and intellect are fairly shared between men and women. So when I look at the workforce, that we've got a persistent 15% pay gap that's been there pretty much steady since 1997, we've not made progress on this. When I hear that only 7 of the big company CEOs in this country are women, when I know that there are a lot of boards of big companies in this country that don't have a single woman on them, that tells me that it's not to do with agreeableness and it's not to do with intellect, it's to do with some discrimination that sits at the heart of our workforce. And there's so much more that we could be doing to try to help this problem. It happens at the top of the workforce, as some of the ones that I've talked about, but at the bottom of the workforce too. You know, the penalty rates decision where 700 Australians are going to have pressure put on their wages, that will disproportionately affect women. So we have this dual issue of women not getting to senior roles in their companies and organisations, but also this problem at the other end of the labour market where not very well paid professions tend to be dominated by women. So we need to try to fix this problem, and I think, you know, we'll hear from Zed in a moment, but I think transparency is a big part of this. You know, we need to understand more. Companies need to be more accountable about why there is a difference between what men and women are being paid.
I'm just going to throw to Anthony, and then this issue became huge in the UK because of an issue with BBC pay, and it became very public because everyone knows who the BBC presenters are, and it proved to be that male presenters were generally getting a lot more money than female presenters doing the same work.
A lot more money, yes. It was outrageous when the figures were published. I mean, there's no question but that equally qualified people doing the same job should be paid the same. It's just as simple as that. And part of the problem, and it's a multi-causal problem, obviously, but part of the problem is that the way that we work, the way we structure the working life, the way the economy functions, actually militates against women very often. You know, when men start getting pregnant and having babies, I'll bet you there will be a really big change in the working hours and the working day and the structure and how people think about these things. That's just one small aspect of it. But I agree with Clare. I think it has to be a very, very long-standing, unconscious attitude of discrimination against women, the feeling that you would very much rather, if you're a man, be sitting around a boardroom table with other men than with you know, women who may bring a completely different perspective to things and make you feel uncomfortable in that environment. And that kind of discrimination is very difficult to root out because the people who are doing the discriminating are not conscious of the fact that they're doing it.
Zeb, we're nearly out of time, but you can respond.
Well, look, I just make the point you talked about BBC transparency. The government has called on the ABC to publish those numbers, and it may well show a very different story from the BBC. And you know what we hear from ABC management is that it would, and that would be a wonderful thing. On the broader question, you know, there's no doubt that where there is unjust discrimination against women or against anyone else, we need to find ways of addressing that. There's all sorts of strategies for that. There is no doubt that there is also complexity to the story. If I look at my own family situation with my wife, we've made decisions as a family that have held her back in her earning potential, but there is no doubt that she has made those decisions with me. She is an independent woman, she is a dietitian, she's highly qualified, much smarter than I am, but of course not able to earn the same amount that I've been able to earn, but we've made choices. So there's always a complexity to these things. It's never as simple as just saying, well, we'll pass a law for this or we'll pass a law for that. But where there is unjust discrimination, where people are not being paid what they are worth because they are women, that is absolutely unacceptable and we need to work very hard against it.
I'm afraid we're over time. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, AC Grayling, Z Seselja, Harriet Harman, Catherine McGregor and Clare O'Neill. Thank you very much, and you can continue the discussion with Q&A Extra on News Radio and Facebook Live, where Scott Wales is joined by Lisa Anise of the Diversity Council. We've asked the new Deputy Prime Minister, Michael McCormack, to join the panel next Monday. He's had a rather busy day, so we're still waiting for his answer. But definitely with us will be Labor Deputy Tanya Plibersek, Greens leader Richard Di Natale, the Daily Telegraph's national political editor Shari Markson, and Pakistani English author Camilla Shamsi, whose latest novel explores terrorism, identity and what it means to be a Muslim living in the West. Until next week's Q&A, good night.